Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start by thanking you so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Jacobs. I'm the Deputy Director of WorkRise, which is a new research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility hosted by the Urban Institute, where I'm also a senior fellow. So today we're thrilled to co-host with the New School a research briefing with Dr. Darrick Hamilton. Derrick has spent his remarkable career bringing research and evidence to bear on the debates and decisions that will move our society towards greater racial and economic justice, greater equality and inclusion, and greater prosperity shared by all. As a public intellectual, Derrick's ideas have found their way into Congress, presidential campaigns, the mainstream media, and the culture at large. He's been instrumental in crafting policy proposals such as baby bonds and a federal jobs guarantee that have inspired legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. During the 2020 campaign, he served as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force and advised numerous candidates and members of Congress. Derrick's work is widely cited in the national media coverage of the economy, and he's been profiled by the New York Times, Politico, Mother Jones, and the Wall Street Journal. We are very fortunate to include Derrick as a member of the WorkRise Leadership Board. WorkRise brings together researchers, employers, worker advocates, policymakers, and practitioners to generate a research agenda and to drive forward new evidence, strengthening economic security and accelerating economic mobility for all workers. And Derrick's contributions to our work have been invaluable. Derrick recently joined the New School as the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and founding director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy. The Institute conducts research to understand the structures of inequality and develop knowledge about the pivotal roles of race, power, and social stratification. And the Institute also works to cultivate the next generation of scholars who bring diverse backgrounds and perspectives on solving society's greatest challenges. Derrick was recently named a 2020 Freedom Scholar through a program jointly funded by the Marguerite Casey Foundation and Group Health Foundation. As been amply documented, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare occupational segregation, discrimination, and other stark inequities in our labor market. It's widened racial and gender disparities in health, wealth, and labor market outcomes. Today, Derrick will share insights that deepen our understanding of how workers from different racial groups experience recessions, including the one we're living through now. He will also explore the role played by educational attainment in the labor market experiences of workers from different backgrounds. And following Derrick's presentation, we will discuss with our expert panel ideas for how we can build back more equitably and inclusively as our economy recovers. Before I turn it over to Derrick, I want to share a few housekeeping items. These are probably familiar to the many of you who have attended virtual events for the last year. We are recording this event. We'll be posting the recording afterwards on our website, so please be sure to let all your friends who missed it know that they can watch it recorded and you can watch it again. All participants are muted, but we encourage you to submit questions or comments through the Q&A box at any time. That's the Q&A box, not the chat box. You can also join the conversation online using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Derrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is a privilege and honor to work with you on WorkRise, and I'm looking very forward to the work that we're going to do. So I am going to try to speed through this a little bit because I want to make sure there's ample time for the panel, which is wonderful, and I'm grateful for all the participants who've agreed to be on it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the co-authors of this report. I have the privilege to present it before you, but it really was a joint effort, a group effort. Afranima Beale, Christopher Famagetti, Avi Green, Kyle Strickland, and David Wilcox. And I also want to point out that a lot of the empirical results and research that's presented in the paper is due to the generous contributions of Afranima and Chris lending some of their dissertation work. And by the way, Afranima just recently defended her dissertation, so a big shout out to her for that. All right, next slide, please. This is perhaps the most important slide that I'm going to present throughout the presentation. and that is education is not the great equalizer for economic security and social mobility. That goes against the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that as we go through economic downturns, one of the reasons that Black workers fare worse is because of where they're distributed along in terms of skill attainment. And that's partially true, but what our findings are demonstrating is that across recession, the most educated Blacks, those with a college degree, are actually harmed more relative to their white peers. In other words, race becomes more salient within that strata of degree attainment compared to others. It's kind of related to what Sir Arthur Lewis, the first Nobel laureate in economics who's Black, and the only one, hopefully he won't always be the only one, he talks about competing and non-competing groups. So he has a theory of race which says that one way to maintain social hierarchy of one identity versus the other is to control who has access to the characteristics that'll be rewarded in the labor market. Hence, who are the competing groups? But then he has a theory by which discrimination comes into play, which is for those members of the subaltern group or the marginalized group who are able to attain competitive features in the labor market, it is those that will face the harshest relative treatment because they are the most competitive. In other words, racism becomes strategic. Next slide, please. So education matters within group without a doubt, but social structures have never permitted Black people throughout our history to convert their education or their skills in general or their resources in general into desired outcomes at the same rate as white people. And what this report is demonstrating is that this is particularly true across recession. Next slide, please. And in fact, I'll say a little more about education. We know that that disparities persist across education, and oftentimes they even worsen. For example, in the domain of wealth, we know that often Black households where the head graduated from college have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. Also, when we look at health outcomes, as the report will demonstrate, we have mortality differences between Blacks and whites in general, but those disparities not only persist with education, they worsen. And that is indeed a phenomenon that we have to deal with in our political economy. All right, so this recession is different. If we look at unemployment throughout this pandemic, by April of 2020, pretty much unemployment was pervasive throughout the land. Overall, we had an unemployment rate of about 15%, with the Black and Latino rate above 16% and the white rate hovering around 14%. Usually the disparities are far more dramatic, particularly in an economic downturn, but we made a moral decision to hibernate our economy to save lives. Now, the narrative that pits our economy against our health, well, that's also a false dichotomy because the number one indicator of economic well-being has to include our health. So I just want to make that point. But the adage that Black people are the first fired and last hired throughout economic business cycle, well, we see as we relax some of our social distancing criteria and began to open businesses up again, we see that disparity is reemerging. The more recent unemployment numbers show that the Black unemployment rate is over 9% and about 5.7% for whites. Next slide, please. And then another feature of this pandemic and recession is the vulnerability that work presented in general. For example, if we look at CDC projections of mortality differences across race, if we look at the last row, we could see that natives, Blacks, and Latinos have hovering close to 3 times the mortality rate as a white person as it relates to COVID-19. And if we put this into context, with Blacks making up about 13% of the population and already nearly 490,000 deaths due to COVID to date, that would suggest that we've already lost about 175,000 Black lives, or a surplus of close to 115,000 lives that would not have occurred if we had had a medical and political economy that treated Blacks and whites equally. Indeed, one may even question or wonder if our political response to the pandemic might have been different if the face of mortality was less Black. Next slide, please. So hence, we're going to examine not just wages and employment across business cycles. We're going to look at what it meant to be exposed to the virus in the form of essential work. And we can see across demographic groups, across race, ethnicity, and gender, we can see that many people were exposed to the pandemic in the form of being an essential worker, but it was higher for Black, Latinx, and certainly for women. Next slide, please. So what we do in the report is we create this crowding index, this measure of occupational crowding, which attempts to determine, given the degree attainment of a group throughout society, the over or underrepresentation in a particular occupational sector, period. So for example, if we look at essential workers, we can see that white men compared to everyone else in the economy were underrepresented. That 0.87 statistic at the bottom row of the crowding index indicates that there's about a 13% lower representation of white men compared to everyone else if they were sorted equally throughout the economy based on their degree attainment. And then the second column indicates that, well, it's not just crowding into essential work category, but even within the sector, wages aren't distributed equally. So for the whites that are in that sector, the white men, they have about 30% higher wages than everyone else. And then finally, we did a calculation of what would happen, what is the relationship between occupational crowding or sorting and actual wages of occupations within the essential worker sector. And what we find is that statistic of 0.07, it suggests that for every $10,000 increase in the increment of wages of an occupation in that sector, the degree of crowding of whites goes up by 7%. In other words, even though they're underrepresented in that sector, they earn higher wages and they work in jobs that are paid relatively more. That's what this is showing. And then this analysis this analysis also allows for somewhat of an intersectional lens. So for example, with Black women, we don't just compare Black women to white women, which is the top row. We also look at Black women compared to white men. So we see that 30%, there's a 30% overrepresentation of Black women in the essential work category relative to white men. And they typically earn 60 cents on the dollar relative to white men in that sector, and that they are crowded into occupations such that for every $10,000 increase in the average wage of that occupation, their representation falls by 16%. And we can look that this is true for other racial groups like Latinx women, and also true for Black men relative to white men as well. Okay, and then we also can look at white women compared to white men. I won't go through this in super detail in the interest of time, and it's a lot I want to show you. So although white women were proportionally represented to white men in this sector writ large, they were crowded into jobs in this sector such that for every $10,000 increase in the wage of a typical occupation in this sector, their representation of white women relative to white men fell by 5%. And on average, they got about 83 cents on the dollar. Next slide, please. We also took a look at certain particular sectors within the essential work. Like we knew by the summer that the agricultural industry posed some really high risk of COVID mortality. And it's also known that this is a very low wage sector. I believe the average wage in the food and agricultural sector is about $32,000, which is much lower than average wages in general. Next slide. And in this analysis, we also looked at an intersection of whether you were foreign born or the way we were able to operationalize it, non-citizens versus citizens. And we can see huge crowding. So if we compare Latino men and women or Latinx men and women to their white counterparts that are not citizens, we could see that there's a huge overrepresentation. For example, Latinx women compared to white men are nearly 300% more likely to be crowded in this sector, and on average earn about 50 cents on the dollar as a white men counterpart. So, things are emerging that some groups are highly exposed to the virus, and in their exposure to the virus relative to their peers in similar jobs, they receive much lower wages. Next slide, please. We also did an analysis where we looked at, well, within the essential work sector, some jobs have greater risk than others. So we use this definition of employment of, do you work with coworkers or customers within arm's length, and determine them to be high proximity versus those in the essential work category who are not arm's length away. Next slide, please. And here we get a similar pattern that I've described before, where white men in this category, wow, I only have 5 minutes left. Okay, I got to move on. So let me move on and just basically sum up and say that the point is that, can we, next slide, please. Next slide. And then we also know that as we open up the economy, we're going to end up with, regardless of whether you're an essential worker or not, some jobs have relatively high physical proximity versus others with lower physical proximity. And the point being is that with high physical proximity, you again get this pattern where white men are underrepresented in the high physical proximity. So they're about 40% underrepresented, but yet when they're in that industry, they earn about 40% higher wages compared to everyone else. Next slide, please. And now here's our analysis looking at wage disparity across business sectors. Next slide. All right, so here we can see that we can look at the average Black to white wages for those with a college degree versus those that don't have a college degree across business cycle. So if you look at the gray area, that's recession period. And we have the 1991 recession, the 2001 recession, and then the Great Recession of 2007. And across all workers, if you look at that black line, which is college degree attainment, you can see a huge decrease in relative wages for Blacks to white across that recession. And then if we look down and isolate only on men to avoid some gender confounding in labor markets, you can see this also pronounced again. Next slide, please. So we go a little further. We try to decompose wage inequality into two components. It's this Oaxaca blinded decomposition technique that allows us to look at differences in efficacy in being able to convert these labor market characteristics that I have listed into desired outcomes for one group, one racial or ethnic group relative to another. So basically, one can interpret this as a measure of discrimination. So not just, part of the reason why there's Black-white wage inequality, it might be due to where they're located, what type of sector they work in, but independent of these control characteristics of the labor market, there's a return to these characteristics and how the labor market treats your characteristic. Next slide, please. And here's the key finding. That black line looks at the most competitive Black workers, those with a college degree relative to whites with a college degree, and that looking at the component of wage inequality due to structural factors, labor market treatment, we see that across business cycles, a steep increase in the differences due to treatment in the labor market of Blacks versus whites, and explaining that wage disparity that I demonstrated to you before. So in essence, what this slide is showing is that those Blacks with a college degree suffer the highest penalty to wages compared to other educated groups of Blacks versus whites across business cycles. Next slide. We looked at home ownership, and again, in the interest of time, I can tell you that red line at the bottom looks at college graduates, and across the last Great Recession, discrimination, the differential return to characteristics, or what we measure as labor market discrimination, had a severe increase for college-educated Blacks as it related to home ownership. Next slide. So let's get to some recommendations. Let's get to some conclusions. I think I got a little bit of time left. So the obvious thing we can do is, in this pandemic, make sure that we're able to contain the vaccine. Next, we need to think about federal aid going to state and local governments that have responsibility and huge lifts in making sure that people are employed in municipal services. We need to expand the social safety net. We need to make sure that people are whole throughout this recession. And then here's one that I think is particularly important. We need direct public hiring to address the massive unemployment, and also to ensure that we're building up infrastructure, both physical and human, to make us more resilient to the next pandemic. Next slide. We need to be able to measure, actually, you know what? I'm over time. I can tell you that we need policies that are going to create conditions for progress. So Biden administration accurately gave values of policies that are going to impact racial equity, that we need to make sure we're valuing racial equity. We're also going to need accountability. I'm all for education. We need to make sure that education is being geared to empower people, not just for vocational purposes, but to be able to address these issues. We need to restore federal and state aid to higher education so that we don't end up with our young people with massive debt as they wait out this recession in higher education. That's a big problem. So we can talk about student loan. Next slide. Just about done. We need to redress tax policy. Our biggest fiscal tool, tax policy, needs to be more equitable. We need to think about it that way. We need to understand that taxes aren't just mechanisms of collection, but we can actually, even as this pandemic demonstrated through our fiscal response, use the IRS to empower people more directly. We need to break down the connection between local property taxes and school funding if we want greater equity. And we need to recognize that the biggest condition is wealth itself. So we need to address this intergenerational wealth mobility. Next slide. I'm actually going to skip these, but I'll actually say the last thing is we need to make sure that we have, all policy, all academic endeavors begin with some normative perspective. And we need to recognize that to address the status quo, we need diversity of experiences to come in so that we can come up with innovative new solutions to address those structural inequities that I described before. And then finally, next slide. Thank you. Thank you to all these people. I'm sorry I shortchanged them with my time and I won't be able to go through them all, but I now want to introduce with great pleasure the moderator of our panel. And if you're a public radio listener, you've likely heard our moderator's voice on your commute home. Kimberly Adams is the correspondent and host of Marketplace, one of America's most popular business news programs. Kimberly covers the intersections of politics and the economy from Washington, D.C. She serves on the board of governors of the National Press Club. And prior to reporting from D.C., Kimberly was a freelance journalist based in Cairo, Egypt, where her coverage of the Arab Spring and the subsequent political, social, and economic upheavals received numerous awards. Kimberly has also worked as a producer of national public radio, covering arts, culture, politics, and breaking news. Kimberly, we are delighted to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel. So thank you, Derrick, and thank you, WorkRise, for this opportunity to moderate. I'll just tell our audience, I know he had to speed through that, but if you have a chance to go and read the full paper by Derrick and his co-authors, there's just so much really new and interesting data in there that I think will help shape the conversation moving forward. But I do want to get right to the panel so that we can then get to your questions. I'll remind everyone, we are going to have an audience Q&A at the end. So as you hear from our panelists, please put those questions into the Q&A. And now I'll introduce all of our panelists. If y'all can go ahead and turn on your videos. We have Melody Barnes, who is the co-director for Policy and Public Affairs at the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia, where she is also professor of practice at the Miller Center and a distinguished fellow at the law school. She is the former director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Obama. Hello, Melody.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
And then Colleen Briggs is head of community development and financial health in the Office of Corporate Responsibility at JP Morgan Chase. Hello, Colleen. Colleen, you're muted, so go ahead. Great.
No, it's okay. Great to see you.
And Carmen Rojas is president and CEO of the Marguerite Casey Foundation and is the co-founder and served as the first CEO of the Workers Lab. Welcome.
Hi, thanks, Kimberly.
And welcome to all. Melody, let's start with you. On its very first day, the Biden-Harris administration issued an executive order on racial equity and justice, directing the federal agencies to do internal reviews with that lens in mind. There have been several other executive orders since then on racial justice and equity. And the Domestic Policy Council, which you used to run, along with the Office of Management and Budget, is tasked with overseeing this effort. Do these efforts of these early days begin to chip away at some of the issues that Derrick has laid out in his presentation?
Great. Thanks for the question, Kimberly. And it's wonderful to be with everyone this afternoon. And congratulations to Derrick and your co-authors on the paper. I think that we should think about this series of executive orders, presidential memoranda as an important step, but not a final step. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's significant that the White House, that the President of the United States is talking about systemic barriers when thinking about communities of color and other communities that have been marginalized, because we don't have to go that far back before we find a place where people were not using that language. There are still a lot of people who are not using that language and who are not thinking in those terms. So I think that's important. Secondly, because when the DPC and OMB put out these kinds of memoranda, when these kinds of executive orders are sent out across government, it's a set of guideposts, and it sends a significant message to everyone in government that this is the way that we're going to approach these problems. This is the way the White House is thinking about these problems. And basically, everybody needs to start to get themselves on board in using this lens to approach the problem and approach these challenges. And it also sends a message to the wider public that the government has a role to play. So I think that's important. Also, we have the series of 4 executive orders in addition to the one that the president signed that said, hey, we're going to look at systemic barriers. But we have a series of executive orders that, no one, I think, is pretending that this is the whole solution. But instead, I think this was a way to start to send signals that we're going to look in these areas and that we're going to start to scratch on these issues. And this is the tip of the iceberg for us. So I think it was a signaling mechanism that was important. And also saying that, as Derrick said, race and racial bias is very potent in our society, and we need to take a look at that. And then I think it's also important to look at what was done as the beginning. And I think this is particularly important for advocates. Say, if you're going to take a look, then the next step is to measure. and that you need to start to put that kind of policy apparatus in place, those mechanisms in place, so that you're not just looking and saying, wow, there's gambling in here, that we've got a problem here, but in fact that you're measuring, and then measuring can then start to shape a policy agenda. The last thing I'll say is that I think these executive orders also send a critical message about the limitations of executive action, of executive authority, and that this can only take you so far if you really want to start to make something that can approximate more permanent change. Then legislative authority, legislative action is also going to have to be taken.
Thank you so much, Melody. Carmen, one of the key issues of the paper that Derrick and his co-authors have put out, it raises is how occupational segregation leads to Black and Latinx workers being crowded into essential work. What will it take to end that kind of occupational segregation?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Kimberly. And really, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I have to say, it's such a treat to be here with Margaret Casey Foundation's Board Chair Melody and one of our Freedom Scholars, Derrick, and to be in this conversation with all of you. I think if I were to take a step back from this research, I think it does such an amazing job at seriously laying out what the long-term systemic impacts of white supremacy have been on our economy. And I think it does something that a lot of research from the field of economics lacks, which is to make clear a connection between political imperatives and economic practice. This is most clear, I think, like, Kimberly, in labor market crowding practices, but it's also very clear in a conversation that we're seeing nationally right now, which is in terms of debt burden, and specifically the generation of people of color who are struggling under the weight of student debt. When I step back and I think about how to address issues like labor market crowding, I think as a country, we've approached them from the perspective of representation. And so we all know these initiatives to hire 1, 2, 3, 4 Black, Latinx, Native, or API people to represent some sort of a market shift in labor market practice or economic priorities, and maybe even to signal an end to the most foundational practices of white supremacy in our economy. I also think that sort of tacked on to this, and I think the paper does a great job in noting sort of the limits of education, there are also the endeavors that seek to train or prepare or build the capacity of people of color, which are, for me, live in this universe of representational approaches. I think that we need something radically different if we're truly going to see the creation of a representative economy. This means really shifting from representation to reparations and truly committing to repairing the harms of centuries of anti-Blackness, Native erasure, and nativist tendencies that treat people of color as disposable features in our economy and not as whole human beings. I know, as Derrick well knows from all of his work as well, that sort of bringing up reparations is a sticky issue. But like the recommendations in the paper and the recommendations that Derrick offered, I think that there are ways that we can repair the harms that are less sticky, raising the minimum wage, reforming our tax system so that those who have made the most off of public investments in infrastructure and technology pay their fair share, expanding our social safety net, and investing in infrastructure. I think all of these things truly have reparative effects. When it comes to work specifically, I think we need a new governing regime, and I'm really excited to see what's to come in the coming years. We need to really reject the practices of creating a class of working poor. For far too long, we've accepted that people can work 20, 40, 60 hours a week in this country and still be poor. I think we need a regime around work that's invested in creating a set of universal policies and protections available to all working people, not just white collar working people. And one that disconnects those things that we all need to live, like quality healthcare, from our participation in the labor market. And so for me, Kimberly, I'm really I'm really excited that this research makes visible all of these tensions and hopeful that we will start to enter into this new regime of work that really values the lives of working people in this country.
Thank you. Colleen, Derrick's first slide highlighted how education and training are just not enough to close this racial wealth gap, that Black workers don't experience the same returns on investments in their education compared to white workers, particularly during economic downturns. Now, when we think about corporate America, in the last year, we have seen so many statements and promises and pledges of new commitments to racial equity and justice. What action is following from all of those very, very public statements?
Well, thank you, Kimberly. And also thank you for letting me join this conversation, and congrats again to Derrick and the team. You know, I should say, I think just building on the points that have already been made and that Derrick so eloquently, I think, highlighted is, in addition, you know, we know that the pandemic exacerbated a lot of these longstanding racial disparities, but I think importantly, it also accelerated our nation's collective awareness of racial injustice and inequality. And I think corporate America is part of that overdue awakening. And I think what we're seeing is an increasingly understanding around the importance of moral and economic leadership. And this is no longer just a moral imperative, but I think increasingly corporate America is seeing it's a business imperative. And you know, the San Francisco Fed just put out a report this week that showed racial and gender disparities cost the economy more than $2 trillion last year. So I think the solutions, they have to go beyond words, not only because investors and employees and stakeholders demand it, but that the resiliency and the growth of the firms really require that we tackle these issues. And I think, as Derrick also highlighted, in order to move the needle, we've got to think about sort of these structural problems need structural solutions. And so I think the way we sort of, that I've been sort of seeing it is there's sort of 4 key strategies that signal our corporations are making these sort of real and meaningful actions to address racial discrimination and bias within their operations. You know, the first 3 are sort of within their business. So that's looking at, are they using the full assets of their firm to really sort of drive change? Are they actually accountable? And that's sort of getting to Molly's point around measurement. Is it ongoing? And then finally, are they also looking outside of their firm and using their voice to weigh in on some of these policy issues that some of the other panelists had also raised? So I think on that first one, on are they using the full assets of their firm, you know, I think that starts by listening to those who are proximate to the problems and to those who have studied these issues to understand how hiring, products, services, and practices all either create barriers or could exacerbate these gaps. And so, for example, when we were designing JP Morgan Chase's $30 billion commitment to racial equity, it started by listening. And we engaged over 60 different stakeholders to help really examine all the facets of our business. And, you know, related to this conversation, it starts by building an equitable and representative workforce. And I think with so many of the rapid labor market changes, we're seeing that this is actually an opportunity for businesses to really reimagine and rebuild corporate talent practices in a way that could emphasize equity and actually advance mobility. And so that's looking at things like ensuring that workers are prepared for in-demand jobs. And that means we need to bring companies and education and training providers together to train and recruit workers for high demand careers. We need companies to continue to invest in the skills and the mobility of their workers. And so, for example, we just introduced a new program to upskill and reskill some of our employees to help them prepare for some of the rapid changing structures that we're seeing in the economy. But then we also need to see new models of how we're actually bringing in talent into these firms. And that's some of the partners that we're seeing, like we're creating new partnerships with HBCUs to think about improving the pipeline into financial services. But it's also making investments in community colleges, which are the largest job training providers in the US. And then, you know, hiring is one part, but we'll talk about this later in the panel, but that also means corporates need to be thinking about everything from equitable procurement, but also an analysis of their own products. You know, I think on the second piece around accountability, just to double down on where Melody was talking, you know, we need mechanisms to measure progress and then have governance to ensure that we're actually making the intended impact that we want. So, you know, for example, we stood up a new function to help us manage and really assess our progress towards that $30 billion goal and move beyond the numbers, but are we actually having the intended impact of addressing the racial wealth divide? But it's also about creating accountability. So, for example, you know, incorporating diversity and inclusion priorities into performance evaluations. And we've also tied progress to compensation decisions for our executives. That's the kind of accountability measures we need to see. And then I think on the third piece, and is this ongoing, I think, as Carmen was mentioning, this is centuries in the creation, and it's going to require constant vigilance to sort of assess our actions and iterate. And we need to be close and getting feedback from those who are proximate to the problems to push us and to really reimagine sort of how we do business. And so some examples of that is, companies need to conduct regular pay equity reviews and analyses, and then actually implement processes to close those gaps and monitor progress. And then finally, I think corporates have to think about how they leverage their voice in the policy and enabling environment. Corporate America cannot address these issues alone. I think as we've heard here, it's going to require policies to change a lot of the systems that are actually curtailing opportunity in this country. And so we launched recently a policy center that's focused on advancing policies that can promote a more equitable recovery. And that means, JP Morgan's endorsing things like expanded unemployment insurance and renter assistance, coupled with long-term recovery efforts like endorsing baby bonds. And I think not only can we advocate for these policies, but we can also use our data to contribute to the policy discussion. So, for example, we just put out a report from our JP Morgan Institute that used our data to inform the debate around unemployment insurance, and showcasing that we actually found very little evidence that higher unemployment benefits discourage jobless workers from returning to work. So there's ways that, I think all of these are showing that corporate America has sort of an obligation to think differently about how we engage on these issues. It's how we use our advocacy, our philanthropy, our data, our hiring, our products, our practices, our services. All of those have to come together to really reckon not only with our own role in racial inequality, but also to reimagine how we can be part of the solution for an equitable recovery.
Thank you, Colleen. Derrick, bringing you back into the conversation, so much of this is about systems and big picture policies and things that need to be addressed at sort of a national or at least state or local level scale. But much of it also kind of comes down to what Colleen pointed out, hiring. How do we end discriminatory practices and racial bias in something as simple as who gets what job and how much money they make at it?
The simple answer is, like we do with other things we value, attach incentives and disincentives to the behavior that we don't like and the behavior we do like. So we always treat discrimination in a retrospective way. Somebody brings the case, we investigate it, but why can't we prospectively audit entities to see how well they're behaving? And it kind of echoes everything that's already been said. Melody talking about measurement, and Colleen too about measurement and accountability, and Carmen talking about values. If really quick, I know I talked a lot in the beginning, so I'm going to sum it up real quick and say discrimination is not just rooted in bigotry, but rather it's strategic behavior that maintain a privilege. It's an immoral privilege, but a privilege nonetheless. So if we want to root it out, then we need to have incentives and disincentives that actually attach rewards and penalties associated with the behavior we want. So my quick, simple answer would just be proactive audit studies with accountability if people are acting in improper and illegal ways.
Wow, that was condensed. I will point out for the sake of the audience that you have a lot more detailed and expanded answers to a similar question in the paper itself. But I do want to get to these amazing questions that we're getting from the audience. So panelists, if you can just get ready, because we're getting a lot of really smart points here. Are there things that public workforce systems can and should do to decrease occupational segregation? Carmen, since you were talking about that earlier, do you want to take that one?
I do. Thanks so much, Kimberly. Yeah, I do think there are a number of things. So I actually want to carry on Derrick's last point. I think there's one thing about sort of the moment in time we are able to capture when discrimination happens in hiring or in the workplace, but it's also who bears the burden. And this is where right now working people have to bear the burden of filing a claim of discrimination, taking it to court, waiting for it to be resolved. At this point, it actually costs a corporation very little money or time to address an issue with the workplace. And so I think for me, workforce development is interesting because especially in the current context where we're talking a lot about the future of work, it is disconnected from the actual jobs our economy is calling for and needs. So we think about things like care. We are facing what is called a silver tsunami, where people are aging at a rate that we actually don't have care for, and our care infrastructure doesn't exist. So preparing people for jobs that exist and then ensuring that those jobs are quality jobs with high wages, with protections and benefits. So I think oftentimes we think about workforce training as training being the problem. And I think this report does an amazing job at pointing out the limits of education without systemic interventions that actually buoy people's place in the labor market. And so workforce training without these greater systemic interventions seem to be lacking for me.
There's quite a bit of interest in our Q&A about this education piece. Colleen, someone who works for College Track, which is a group that supports students of color and other marginalized groups who are going to college, and they're the first people going to college in their families, brings this question. Given these sobering statistics, what message should we send to our students of color about college completion? If we're, and maybe Dr. Hamilton, you want to add as well, Professor Hamilton, if we're telling students that your education is not enough to close that gap writ large, what message do we have for them?
Professor Hamilton, you want to start? Maybe I can follow.
Okay. So I was laughing because I think the question comes from a friend. I suspect Carolyn Ash is probably out here and asked that question. That's what made me crack up. But I'd say that we think about education as an input into an output, but its essence is as an output. The privilege to be able to gather information and translate it into big ideas is not only intrinsically good for the individual, it's good for society. Perhaps if we had our education in a way that offered more people quality education from grade school through college, it could address some of our big societal problems that we seem to have been struggling to address for so long. So I guess the point is, education as an outcome is in and of itself worth it and valuable. It's a privilege and honor to have a quality instructor that's empathetic to your needs and interests and where you come from, to help offer you facilitation on being able to translate information into aesthetics and big ideas. And we should afford that to everyone as a basic right in the 21st century, period.
Well, I think you have your keynote speaker for your graduation ceremony. I'm pretty sure that was very eloquently done. I think just to build on that, I think what the paper does so well that Carmen was also reinforcing is that it's unfair to put all of the burden on addressing economic mobility on just one intervention. And that I think until we look at all of these systems that are needed to advance worker mobility, it's not to say one of those is not effective, but we still at the same time, for those of us in the field who are focused on how we improve and how we build back a more equitable society coming out of this recession, we have to think about all these other systems that are interconnected and that could really either be an accelerant to mobility or could actually be an anchor on worker mobility. So I think on the acceleration side, that's thinking of things like the point that Professor Hamilton teed up, which is around wealth, and thinking about what are those pathways to wealth creation that we're also promoting concurrently around, thinking about savings, both short and long term. And that's, looking at better products in the market, but also promoting smart policies like removing asset limits and promoting baby bonds. but it's also at the workplace and ensuring people have access to workplace benefits and protections like paid family and medical leave. And I think at the same time, we've got to look at those exorbitant expenses that are an anchor on the mobility of workers and have a disproportionate burden on workers of color. And so that's looking at things like, looking at high quality, affordable homes and ensuring that workers have access to those that are located in proximity to good jobs and good schools. I think, we've made a $22 billion commitment around homeownership and affordable housing, but corporate action is one part. We also need to see policies around increasing funding and looking at incentives for land use and zoning reform, and as well as eliminating discrimination by reinstating affirmatively furthering fair housing and other policies. I think Carmen also teed up, around the caregiving crisis, and that, women are forced out of the labor force at 4 times the rate of men, often due to the caregiving responsibilities. So that reverses generations of progress for female workers. Also looking at things like reducing healthcare costs, and Derrick mentioned reducing student debt. We just put out a report that shows 1 in 4 families spend more than 11% of their take-home income on student loans. So I think the message to this group that I think the paper does so well, which is we have to look at these interconnected issues, and it's unfair to put the burden of mobility only on the skills and education of the worker, and that an equitable recovery is really going to have to think across all these systems and structures around what creates barriers or could accelerate progress for the workers.
Melody, 2 questions about policy that I actually hope you'll take back to back if you don't mind. A question from someone who works at the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Have there been any best policy practices or model legislation to dismantle occupational segregation?
That's a good question. I will be honest, I don't know of model legislation that exists. I don't know if any of the other panelists are aware of model legislation in that regard. One thing I will mention related to that question, but also to an earlier question about some of the, well, I think of them as gating issues, things that we can do to try and prevent segregation in the workforce. I think about things like certifications, and I also think about degree requirements. And in some ways, maybe this connects the dots from the last part of the conversation. And when government or when private sector employers use certifications or degree requirements unnecessarily. And there's certainly been research that's been done in this area that shows that oftentimes there's a degree requirement because there's always been a degree requirement. But when you actually look at the work that's required and the skill sets that are required, that they don't require a college degree. I think also in thinking about the kind of certification that may be required, and making sure that we're aligning those kinds of requirements with actual skills as opposed to an idea or the recreation of ourselves in the workplace. I've got a degree and I do this job, so surely everybody needs a degree to do this job. And those can be gating requirements that prevent people from entering the workplace. So that isn't a model, that's not model legislation, but that's certainly an idea that people are starting to talk about in greater numbers and more quarters as a way to open up job opportunities and wealth attainment opportunities to more people.
That actually perfectly sets up the other question that I wanted to put to you.
And we didn't even plan it.
I know, right? It's mind meld. What do you think about the College for All movement that has taken off over the past 20 years? What is next for higher education's role in the labor market and the employer's use of degrees as a screening mechanism? So some of this you've already addressed just now, but I do wonder, what role do you think higher education providers have in this, if indeed employers need to revisit how they're using these tools?
Right. And I think, Derrick certainly spoke to some of this. There are lots of different ways that we should think about higher education. And there are lots of different ways to go on and get some kind of post-secondary degree or credential or reasons to get them. As I mentioned before, I don't think using them as a gating measure unnecessarily does the employer or the potential employee any good. And it certainly keeps people out of jobs and out of the workforce unnecessarily, and even prevents people from starting to move up a ladder where, maybe you've got a high school degree and some kind of certification, and that means that you're great for XY job. It may mean that later on you go on to get additional certification, or you may turn that into an associate's degree, or you may later turn that into a 4-year degree or something else. But we need to make sure that we've got appropriate alignment. At the same time, I think Derrick makes important points about the value of education, and that also, though, has to start long before we're talking about post-secondary. That needs to start in pre-K and all the way through, so that people are getting an excellent foundation and getting an excellent education, and then are able to make decisions about what they want to do next. And we certainly see that in other countries around the world that do a better job with that than we do in the United States. And God knows I've been in a lot of rooms where these conversations take place, and a lot of policymakers can come up with a lot of reasons why we shouldn't use comparisons to other countries. I think that's Americans tend to put blinders on in that category. I also believe that there is a benefit to education and to higher education in terms of the ways that we prepare ourselves to engage in our communities, to engage as citizens, as residents in the United States, to fully participate, to help shape the government in ways that best serve ourselves and our communities, to explore, to expand our minds. And all of those are important goods that I think Derrick spoke to earlier. So I think there are a lot of different ways to think about it. When we're thinking about employment and we're thinking about wealth creation, we need to make sure there's appropriate alignment. When we're thinking about how we become our best selves, sound like Oprah here, our best selves, we should also think about education. I'll just close by saying this. There is a woman who is, and her name just went out of my head. She was a chaired professor at Princeton. She was an historian, Nell Painter, historian at the University of North Carolina when I was a freshman. I mean, brilliant woman who, after doing all that, decided, you know what, I always wanted to go to art school. So in other words, even with all of that, the educational opportunities and degrees that she had, still saw value in education for other reasons. So there's that to think about as well.
We only have about a minute left, so I'm going to do a rapid round with each of you. If you could very quickly, if there's one thing that we could do as a society, with our government, to sort of prioritize some of these solutions that Derrick and his co-authors lay out in this paper, what would be the one thing that we could do? Very quick, Melody, since you just spoke, what's your number one?
Oh, it's like picking among your children. I think I would. There's so many specific policy interventions. I'm going to pull back to a structural one and say that we need to put in place the architecture so that we are gathering data and information and making it accessible to wide numbers of people to make smarter policy decisions.
Okay, Colleen?
I'm going to double down on that. I really believe that what we can measure will actually be something that we can manage. And until we have the data, until we have the mechanisms to have that accountability, I don't think we'll be able to see progress. So I will I'll vote on Melody's as well around that measurement and accountability framework.
Carmen?
Community organizing. I think the point of having information is important. I think the transparency of information is important. And I think an activated community of people that knows how to use that information to make sure that they are the architects of the economy and democracy that we want is super important as well.
Derrick, you get the last word.
Redefine economic well-being to put people and humans first, to recognize that we can define economic value. That's a political choice. And then the last part is that race is not an issue, gender is not an issue, but rather intricately related to our politics and our economics and need to be thought about well before the outcome stage. I know I said a lot there. Last thing I want to say is big thanks to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Of course, the views don't reflect them for commissioning the paper, and especially Kimberly Brown and Michael George for commissioning the paper. And you too, Kimberly Adams. Thank you.
I was just like, really? What did I do? Anyway, thank you all so much for this amazing panel, and thanks to our audience for the great questions. It's been a pleasure. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. And of course, thank you to WorkRise.
Yes.
Yes, most importantly.